Indomitable Heart by Renette. Chapter 10. Even as he focused on Anakin's training and their missions, part of Obi-Wan's mind lingered on his missing spouse. He was in frequent contact with the hot Mando'a and Arla back on Concord Dawn. Neither Obi-Wan nor any of the others were willing to accept that Jango might be dead, and that communal belief helped reinforce their commitment to finding their Mandalore. As soon as it was feasible, Obi-Wan met up with the clan so he could talk with Miles and Silas about the hunt for Jango, and so Anakin could greet some of them in person. Since it was Anakin's first visit, the hot Mando'a also conducted Anakin's official adoption into the clan and arranged for the forms to be filled on Concord Dawn, where his mother lived and worked. Once both the official and ceremonial aspects were taken care of, Anakin was introduced to more members of the clan. There were a number of teens aboard the Daybreaker, adult by Mando tradition but not yet independent, and yet recognized as full legal adults in Mando or Republic space. Most of them were something like apprentices, getting experience on the starfighters or learning how to fix the ship's systems. Anakin fell in with them readily, especially those who were more mechanically inclined. The pair of Jedi couldn't stay too long, but Obi-Wan was reassured to spend some time among people who missed Jango as much as he did, who were actively looking for their Mandalore. Eventually, though, a mission found its way to them, and Obi-Wan had to reconcile himself to the fact that while he might much prefer to spend all his time searching for clues about what led to Jango's disappearance, duty had to come first. He and Jango had both made that decision early on. Due to having a fairly young Padawan, Obi-Wan was often sent on missions that had a low risk of violence. He assiduously maintained his beskar gam regardless, and wore it day to day. He crafted some armor pieces for Anakin as well, synth leather and door steel gauntlets with a few handy attachments like liquid cable ascension lines, and sheaths for spare tools and weaponry. Anakin rather looked forward to the day he finished growing, so he could design a full set of armor for himself. He'd taken well to the raisonner, and was already nearly fluent in Mando'a, a handy skill for when he and Obi-Wan wanted to converse privately, but couldn't excuse themselves from a room. There were challenges, of course. Obi-Wan tried his best, but he was only human and fallible. He and Anakin could argue for hours over nothing, although thankfully Anakin rarely held a grudge, and Obi-Wan ensured that they at least talked through their disagreements. It helped, too, that within a year of Anakin becoming Obi-Wan's Padawan, only a few months after Anakin's first visit to the Daybreaker, the hot Mando'a took it upon themselves to offer Anakin's mother, Shmi, a place with the clan. She accepted a placement on Concord Dawn, relocating her repair business to a settlement rife with people who thought of the feds fondly. She was family now, after all. Obi-Wan found his Padawan much more tractable when Anakin had fairly regular comms from Shmi, who had been freed at the same time as Anakin but had remained on Tatooine in the intervening years. Despite her freedom, her situation on Tatooine had been a constant source of worry for Anakin, and her easy acceptance into the clan also allowed Anakin to expand his divination of his people a bit further. Anakin had bonded fairly well with other young Jedi before Obi-Wan took him as a Padawan, but still held much of the Order at a distance, his acceptance of them strained by his late arrival at the temple. Obi-Wan did his best to smooth those rough patches when and where he could, understanding all too well the stigma an inauspicious start could leave. Sharing his own past seemed to help. Somehow Anakin had bought in at least a bit to the rumors of Obi-Wan's dedication to code and council. The reputation of the Sith Slayer had gotten tangled up a bit over the years, with some knights painting Obi-Wan as an ideal Jedi when he was well aware of his deviations from code and doctrine. But talking about his defection on Melita Dan seemed to help them both, as did the razzing the hot Mando'a were sure to give Obi-Wan whenever and wherever they met. Unfortunately, they didn't meet as often as Obi-Wan would have liked. The hot Mando'a contracted their mercenary company in the conflicts that were sparking all over the galaxy, while Obi-Wan and Anakin focused on de-escalation of the tensions that led to those conflicts. From their many missions centered on mediation and negotiation, Obi-Wan had a reputation as a trustworthy diplomat, careful compromise, honeying his words and silvering his tongue. The wordplay he'd learned at his master's side stood him in good stead, as did his more recent practice, bickering with Anakin. Anakin listened but couldn't quite get the hang of dissimulation, of shifting the truth to fit their audience's point of view. Obi-Wan found it endearing and again frustrating. When eloquence and logic were not enough, other equally honed skills ensured Obi-Wan and his Padawan's safety. "We do not all have the same strengths," Obi-Wan reminded kindly and frequently when Anakin sulked about having put his foot in his mouth or stuttered when confronted with a pretty face. Obi-Wan's own teenage years were not so long ago, and it would only harm their bond if he was dismissive rather than understanding. "You are far more skilled with machines than I am. It's only fair I have talents you yourself do not possess." Anakin shrugged at that and gave way. Unfortunately, more and more often, their missions of peace ended with sabers drawn. Although proficient with the lightsaber when they first went into the field together, Anakin was forced to become a daunting duelist in short order. He specialized at first in Saresu, mimicking his mentor's deflections and parries. He didn't quite have the patience or endurance for the third form, though. Obi-Wan tried him with Makashi, but that was quickly set aside, as was Ataru. Shien, Anakin finally settled into and began marrying it to the power of its sister form, Gemso. His dedication was necessary. Conflict was spreading and worsening throughout the galaxy. The tensions that had flared up during the term of Chancellor Antilles continued and worsened after he left office and was succeeded by Fang Zar in the Chancellery. By the time Anakin was 19, last-ditch mediation made up the bulk of Obi-Wan and Anakin's missions. Occasionally, they got plum assignments where their presence was purely ceremonial, and thankfully they spent at least a few months each year in temple for Anakin to complete coursework and Obi-Wan to perform instructional rotations. Obi-Wan was always thankful for those months. While he loved his Padawan dearly, being Anakin's sole companion and emotional support could be draining, especially now that Anakin was in his late teens and full of bright ideas and confidence. Obi-Wan did his best to guide the former and nurtured the latter, although he knew some of the masters at the temple bemoaned his Padawan as arrogant. They didn't see Anakin in his low moments, his self-recriminations when his enthusiastic attempts to help failed and people suffered for his actions. Anakin wasn't always the best at planning. He had a tendency to rush in where even a Wookiee would fear to tread. But his heart was usually in the right place. It was one of his more endearing qualities, in Obi-Wan's opinion, although it was also the one most likely to get them in trouble. By the 10th anniversary of the liberation of Naboo, Obi-Wan thought that if he could just get his Padawan to consider consequences a bit more, Anakin was almost ready for his knighthood trials. Obi-Wan was both elated and nostalgic, thinking on the prospect. On one hand, he was immensely proud of how much Anakin had developed as both a person and a Jedi. On the other, he would miss his Padawan a great deal once they parted ways. He'd become accustomed to Anakin's grumpy complaints and fervid curiosity trailing at his shoulder over the years. Anakin was well aware that Obi-Wan was training him towards the trials by the time they were dispatched with Knight Unduli and Padawan Ophi to a border dispute on Ancion. That they were sent to mediate such a puzzle was something like a compliment from the council, even with the others along. Despite that, Beatrice was a newer Padawan, still getting her feet under her. Her mentor, Luminara, was renowned in the Order for her serenity and knack for settling disputes. With so much duplicity on Ancion and so many leads to chase down, the Jedi wanted their best negotiators on the job. The reputation and skill of the 4 Jedi wasn't enough to prevent conflict on Ancion, and they were soon on the run. The 4 of them stuck together, but headed out away from the larger population centers. They were sheltered by some of the nomadic tribes, and managed even to achieve some of their mission goals in meeting with the Baruki Overclan and resolving their dispute with the Janul clan. However, there was still the matter of Soyrg the Hutt, the instigator of much of their troubles, to resolve when their mission was cut short. "Obi-Wan!" Anakin called, waving his comm in the air as he drew his master's attention. Obi-Wan had turned his comm to silent while speaking with some of the tribesmen who had taken them in here on Ancion and left the sound off once the conversation finished, meditating to determine the path forward. There was no question that the tensions here were manufactured, but Obi-Wan couldn't yet see the best way to de-escalate the situation. For Anakin to call him so loudly when he knew Obi-Wan was meditating, it had to be serious. Obi-Wan took out his comm and thumbed the sound back on, eyes widening as a stream of alerts began sounding, rattling the device in his hand. Quickly, he selected the most recent and opened a strongly worded recall notice from the temple. All knights were to return to Coruscant at best possible speed. Alarmed, he selected the message marked most urgent. Obi-Wan, there's no easy way to say this. Y'all's been killed. The Republic is at war. Come home at once. There will be a memorial as soon as you arrive. Mace's stern voice bit out. Obi-Wan felt like his heart dropped down through his stomach and out the soles of his boots. He nearly swayed in place before forcing himself to take a deep breath. He couldn't fall apart. Not now. Not here. Taking another steadying breath, Obi-Wan looked up in time to see Anakin's face pale. Although Anakin and Yan didn't get on terribly well, there was a stiff sort of affection between them, if only for Obi-Wan's sake. Master, Anakin asked. I don't know yet. Obi-Wan admitted, his heart racing. I've only seen Mace's personal message and the general recall so far. I'll make our excuses to our hosts if you'll find us the fastest transport to Coruscant. Anakin nodded, jaw firming now that he had a mission to undertake, and he spun on his heel and practically sprinted to secure transport to the nearest port. Obi-Wan bowed out of their mission as politely as he was able, making promises he wasn't sure he'd be able to keep. As soon as he could, Obi-Wan gathered up their things and headed for the port. He found Anakin, Luminara, and Barriss already there, all of them on edge, although Luminara hid it best. Obi-Wan knew he wasn't much better. He could barely breathe through the knot of grief that had lodged in his throat. He forced himself not to think about Dooku. His master would want him to do the most good for the most people. Even so, it was hard to concentrate on the other questions the communiques had raised in his mind. How had things escalated so quickly to actual war? While tensions had been rising for years, and Obi-Wan, like all Jedi, had the scars and stories to prove it, he hadn't thought they were at the point of war. The separatists, outside the corporations, had some valid grievances at the outset of their movement, but the presence of the corporations themselves had seemed counter to their arguments, and the member states too quarrelsome to pull together as a fighting force. Obi-Wan had thought they wouldn't ever actually organize well enough to form a separate alliance of planets, despite their stated ambitions. He hadn't read enough to know much else. His mind kept circling back to Yan's death. From the little Obi-Wan had glanced through his grief, the separatists had managed to find a figurehead to rally behind, and Obi-Wan dreaded learning his master's part in this escalation. And he had to have played a part, no matter how small, for his death and the announcement of war to be so inextricably linked. While Yan was a skilled diplomat, his patience had waned in recent years, and he'd become even more vocal in his criticism of the Council, the Senate, and the Republic itself. While those critical views sometimes helped Dooku on his diplomatic missions, they had won him no friends in the Order, as few masters or counselors liked to be scolded like younglings about how much more the Jedi could be doing if they were able to intervene in situations before or without requests from the Senate. Obi-Wan watched Anakin pace for much of the journey forward. Luminara meditated while Barriss busied herself with reading. Obi-Wan tried all three methods of subsuming his anxiety, reaching out into the Force on occasion, trying to feel his master. Dooku was one with the Force, according to all Jedi doctrine and dogma, and Obi-Wan wanted more than anything else in the galaxy to feel his presence once more. Just a hint, a breath, the slightest indication that something of Dooku still lingered on. But there was only an aching absence in the Force where his master had always been, no lingering reassurance at all. From the public spaceport where they docked, it was a few hours by shuttle to the temple. Obi-Wan did his best to maintain his facade for the duration, but he was certain his mask slipped more than once. Dooku had been a pillar of support for half of Obi-Wan's life, a trusted confidant and beloved guide. He had reassured Obi-Wan through the tough patches when he felt overwhelmed by his responsibility to Anakin, or his despair at Jango's continued absence. He had given Obi-Wan invaluable advice when needed, and listened with a cup of tea and lack of judgment when Obi-Wan needed to rant. His master was gone, and for all that he knew, doctrine exhorted him to celebrate Dooku's return with the Force, not grieve. Obi-Wan's heart ached with loss. When they arrived at the temple, Master Windu himself awaited them, expression grim. If Obi-Wan had carried any doubt about the severity of the situation, it would have evaporated in the face of Windu's formidable scowl. Obi-Wan had never envied the responsibilities of the counselors, and it was clear that the Master of the Order's duties weighed heavily on him.
Knights Kenobi and Unduli, Padawan Skywalker and Offie,
Mace greeted. Master Windu, they chorused with abbreviated bows.
The council will debrief you immediately,
Windu informed them and led them up into the spire himself. Sitting, Windu glanced at the other members of the High Council. All the chairs were filled, but some counselors were present only via holo.
Have you been keeping abreast of the news as you travelled?
Mace asked.
We were in hyperspace for the duration, until we reverted at the Coruscant beacons,
Obi-Wan said with a shake of his head.
I can only speak for myself, but I've read all that was sent prior to our departure from Ancion, and nothing since. I glanced at the news when we reverted, but were out of the loop enough I couldn't distinguish fact from rumor.
Anakin said, and Luminara and Barriss nodded their affirmation that they'd looked at the news as well, but not understood all that was reported. Mace let out a weary sigh.
I'll tell you now that even with our shadows pausing everything, we're having trouble separating truth from rumor as well,
Mace admitted.
These are the facts as we know them. Master Dooku was chasing down a new lead on a former member of the council, Cypher Deus, who we lost touch with some years ago when he was on a mission for Chancellor Valorum. We had presumed Master Cypher Deus had rejoined the Force, and Master Dooku was able to confirm that. He also learned, however, that Master Cypher Deus died under extremely suspicious circumstances, and we authorized a continuation of Master Dooku's mission to investigate what had happened. Before his death, Master Dooku sent a large data packet from Kamino, a world outside Republic space on the edge of the Rishu maze. We're still pausing everything, and I doubt Master Dooku was able to get the full picture in the time he was there, but it paints a grim picture. Someone, possibly Master Cypher Deus himself, ordered an army of cloned soldiers, millions strong, in the name of the Republic. Kamino itself is not in our infobanks, and Madame New reports that there are a number of suspicious deletions in the master log. Deletions she did not authorize. In the course of his investigations into the creation of this army, Master Dooku had a lead that took him from Kamino to the separatist world of Geonosis. He sent a transmission from there, but it was garbled. Our slicers are working to clean it up, but we're not sure how much data we'll recover. His last transmission from Geonosis documented a massive foundry producing battle droids, and the presence of numerous well-known separatists, including the heads of most of the corporate guilds. Less than a day later, Master Dooku was publicly executed in Petrenegi Arena on Geonosis on accusations of espionage. Mace spit out, and Obi-Wan swallowed around a lump in his throat. Force, how much would Dooku have despised such a death, Obi-Wan thought. Geonosis was much discussed, despite being a desert world with few natural resources. It was a stronghold of the Confederacy, inhabited by insectoid sentients. They delighted in their public executions, chaining prisoners to posts in their arena and then setting feral animals on them so the prisoners were mauled to death in front of cheering crowds that numbered in the hundreds of thousands. It was likely Dooku had been tortured in captivity prior to his execution, and then to be made a public spectacle. No, Dooku would have abhorred such an event, although he would have faced it with as much dignity as remained to him. Obi-Wan's heart ached. The Archduke Poggle of Geonosis has named himself head of the Confederacy of Independent Systems and declared war on the Republic, citing Yon's presence as an instigating act. Chancellor Zar was granted emergency powers and has used those powers to declare war on the CIS in Dan, while also calling for negotiations to see if this can't be solved peaceably. However, he has also nominally taken control of the army Yon found. Mace continued. According to Yon's information, the Kaminoans designed the army to be led by Jedi generals. So far, we've been able to push back against that particular indignity, but I doubt we'll be able to put the Chancellor off much longer. It would likely be easier for him politically to make the army a Jedi problem. Mace took a breath, pausing in his long recitation. All four of you are due a couple days of rest at the very least. Unfortunately, that's about all we can afford to give you. Even if we aren't pulled into this mess as generals, war on this scale will result in massive unrest, and Senate mandate or not, we have an obligation to assist those we can. We'll hold a memorial for Master Dooku tonight at sunset. You'll find full fact files on your terminals, as well as schedules for the next few days. Mace closed, almost wilting. Although there were many years in disagreements between them, Obi-Wan knew Windu had respected Dooku deeply. Thank you, Master Windu, Obi-Wan said with quiet sincerity. I shall meditate on what you have told us.
Mace nodded and dismissed them with a silent hand wave, his head tilting to rest wearily in his palm.
I'll check what's available at the refectory,
Anakin volunteered when they'd cleared the council chamber doors.
Thank you, Anakin, that would be appreciated,
Obi-Wan said, giving his Padawan a thin smile. It was a handy excuse, Obi-Wan knew, to give him a little time alone with his grief. Courage, Luminara exhorted him, parting, and patted Obi-Wan's bicep before leading Barriss away. Obi-Wan gave her the same dismal smile he gave Anakin, then quickly found his way to his quarters. The air was stale, the flat surfaces dusty. Obi-Wan ignored the blinking message lights on the data suite and instead went straight to his bedroom, shucking out of his armor without checking it over, then collapsing onto his mattress and curling tight into a ball. His master was gone. Obi-Wan had known, of course, that given their respective ages, it was likely that Yan would predecease him. But he hadn't fully prepared himself for Dooku's death. He had never imagined they wouldn't have years yet before he had to worry about Dooku like that. Even when they were in perilous scrapes, Dooku had seemed invulnerable, like nothing could touch him. And now he was gone. A sob hitched in Obi-Wan's chest, and then he was lost, curling around his pillow and weeping inconsolably. When Obi-Wan resurfaced, crusty-eyed and foggy-eyed, he found Anakin sitting with him. His Padawan had wrapped a blanket around Obi-Wan and was pressed against his side. Obi-Wan turned into Anakin's warmth, hugging his little brother to him. He wanted his master, Yan's broad shoulders to lean on and strong arms to wrap him tight, as if he were still a gangly teenager himself. He wanted Jango, the soft rumble of his husband's voice, and the gentle warmth of his affection.
Shoot kuy'gar,
Anakin said, emphasizing the syllables carefully, sounding choked up inside.
Kaysh, cuyir, darasuum.
Obi-Wan choked out, trying to reassure himself with the idea that Yan was still with them. If only in spirit.
No, kyr'adyc, taab'echaaj'la.
Anakin hugged him tight, and Obi-Wan swallowed thickly.
How long until sunset? He rasped out. A couple hours yet. I brought some food from the factory. Why don't you clean up and I'll put on some tea?
Obi-Wan offered gently, and Obi-Wan leaned up, pressing their foreheads together.
Entye,
Obi-Wan said and forced himself to his feet. He did feel rather disgusting. Anakin shuffled off and Obi-Wan made himself go get cleaned up as directed. When he dragged himself out to the common area, washed up and dressed in clean clothing, Anakin had warmed the food and poured each of them a cup of fragrant Shig rather than tea. Obi-Wan smiled slightly at that, the citrusy scent invigorating him a bit before he'd even had any to drink.
Buir,
Obi-Wan said and settled in, sipping at the steaming Shig and eating some noodles. As Obi-Wan had half expected, Anakin had chosen a dish that was spiced heavily enough to bring tears to Obi-Wan's eyes and clear his sinuses. There were many good reasons his Padawan had fit in so well with the Mando'a, and fondness for overly spiced food was one of them. Anakin slurped his own noodles loudly, grinning around his messy mouthful when Obi-Wan gave him a dying glare. Anakin knew by now that poor manners ticked his mentor off, but he had also made a fairly well-calculated guess that Obi-Wan would rather feel just about anything other than sorrow at the moment. He couldn't imagine how devastated he'd be if he lost Obi-Wan, and hoped with all he was that he wouldn't find out any time soon. When they finished eating, Obi-Wan retreated to his room. Anakin debated following after him, but refrained, instead fussing about, straightening things that didn't need straightening. He'd never been to a Jedi funeral before, and he wasn't much looking forward to this one. After knocking about in the common area for a while, Anakin used a fresher and then retreated to his own room, fairly certain that his battered motley of robes and armor wasn't appropriate for the occasion. Hopefully the formal robes the quartermaster had allotted him a few years back still fit. Anakin was fidgeting with his clothing when Obi-Wan reappeared. The trousers fit well enough in the waist, and his tall boots disguised the fact that the legs were more than a few centimeters too short. The tunics were more obviously the wrong size, tight across his chest and shoulders, and too short in the sleeves. The tabards disguised some of it, but Anakin was distinctly uncomfortable, and made more so by the fact that he hadn't been without at least armored gauntlets since he became a Padawan. It was even stranger seeing Obi-Wan in standard Jedi robes, although Anakin was willing to admit the soft garb did suit his mentor. It was strange to see him without his armor all the same. Beskar Gam was as much self-expression as protection, and as long as Anakin had owned Obi-Wan, Obi-Wan had been wearing the same suit of armor weave and durasteel that Jango had given him at Galadran. Obi-Wan gave Anakin a thin smile, and crossed to his Padawan, gently fussing with his tunics a bit. "Won't work. They're too small," Anakin said, and refrained from shrugging. He'd already nearly ripped a seam dressing himself. "We'll have to remedy that," Obi-Wan said quietly. "If we truly get war, I fear there are many funerals in our future." Anakin dipped his head, mouth turning down at the prospect. War. He knew the hot Mando'a made their living as mercenaries, but the prospect of galaxy-wide war was on such a massively different scale, he had difficulty comprehending it. "Bloody separatists," Anakin grumbled. Obi-Wan said mildly and patted him on the shoulder. "Let's get this over with so I can get hammered." Anakin let out a soft scoff, but nodded and accompanied him down through the winding corridors to the memorial hall. There would be no body to cremate. The separatists hadn't deigned to return what was left of Yan for the traditional Jedi funeral rites. The memorial hall Yoda had chosen to celebrate his former Padawan's life was deep in the ancient labyrinthine passages of the temple, resplendent with pre-Reformation frescoes and statuary. It was one of the few chapels remaining with depictions of friendly Mando'a. Yoda recognized that while not as blatant about it as Obi-Wan, Yan Dooku, too, had been claimed by Mandalore, and that Dooku had viewed that adoption as an honor on par with his birthright as a noble scion of one of the great houses of Sereno. All the members of the High Council were there when Obi-Wan and Anakin arrived, along with Jocasta Nu and Tera Sinube, who were among Yan's few remaining age-mates. One of Yan's other friends, kyr'adyc, had come from the Altesian sect with his Padawan Asajj Ventress. Qui-Gon Jinn was there too, as was Jinn's renounced first Padawan, Femor Stal. Obi-Wan nodded his greetings to the room at large, then crossed to Femor and let himself be enveloped in a hug. While they did not see each other often, with their missions so often sending them to the far reaches of the galaxy, they had bonded early in Obi-Wan's apprenticeship to Dooku, when Obi-Wan was constantly struggling with his self-worth after being abandoned by his first master. The ceremony wasn't terribly formal, much to Anakin's relief. Yoda said a few words of remembrance, his voice even smaller and scratchier than usual. Master Jin said a few gruff words as well, all but damning Yan with faint praise. When the eyes of those gathered fell on Obi-Wan, he swallowed, lifting his chin, uncaring of the tears that painted silvery tracks down his cheeks. "Ni sukuyi, gar kyr'adyc, ni partayli, gar darasuum, Yan Dooku," Obi-Wan said, voice thick as he recited the traditional Mando'a remembrance. "Ni partayli, nu kyr'adyc, shi taab'echaaj'la." Anakin glanced around, fairly certain that he was among the minority that understood Obi-Wan's utterance. "Nu kyr'adyc, Draar kyr'adyc, shi taab'echaaj'la." Anakin echoed, and his mentor gave him that thin, sad smile, dipping his head and flooding their bond with quiet gratitude. A few other Jedi spoke, and Anakin did his best to pay respectful attention, more out of an obligation to Obi-Wan than any true desire to listen to their eulogy. Yan had been well known, though, if not always well loved. Anakin was a little surprised that so few people came to the ceremony, given how well known Dooku was inside the Jedi Order. He imagined Yoda had somehow managed to ensure the ceremony itself was somewhat private, reserved for those who knew Yan personally. When the memorial ended, Obi-Wan and Anakin stayed a bit longer, accepting condolences. Anakin was thankful he could mostly just stand stonily at Obi-Wan's shoulder. The idea of reiterating the tired and trite maxims about loss so many times was almost nauseating. He didn't know how Obi-Wan could manage it without ducking someone, especially Master Jin, who had always sneered at Obi-Wan and Anakin both. Anakin knew the tall master had briefly been Obi-Wan's mentor, and while Jin hadn't always agreed with Yan or got along with him, Anakin was grateful not to have to deal with Jin more regularly. While Anakin's own reckless streak was bred in deep and wide, Obi-Wan at least encouraged him towards strategy and planning. Jin's maxims about following the will of the Force, staying in the moment, and not concerning oneself with the future always sounded a bit like excuses to do it as he pleased and rub the council's noses in the consequences instead of dealing with them himself. Thankfully, the standing about and talking was over before too long. The room emptied save Obi-Wan, Anakin, and Master Yoda. Anakin waited awkwardly as Obi-Wan went to the ancient being, kneeling and hugging him gently and sharing a few quiet words. They were soon on their way back up to the residential section of the temple. As they approached their apartment, Quinlan Vos joined them, his recently knighted former Padawan Ayla Secura staying with them.
"Here to impose yourself on my drinking time?"
Obi-Wan guessed in greeting. "Yup," Quinlan said with a slight smile, throwing his arm around Obi-Wan's shoulders. "Figured Ayla could babysit the squad."
"You realize I'm taller than you now, right?"
Anakin asked, and Quinlan grinned at him. "Not up so I suppose, Petey," Quinlan quipped, and Anakin rolled his eyes in exasperation. He actually liked Quinlan most of the time, but the older Jedi could be quite irritant when he put his mind to the task.
"You'll be okay, Order Vote?"
Anakin asked Obi-Wan just to be sure. Spending time with Ayla did sound more entertaining than watching Obi-Wan get plastered, and he'd probably be drinking tihar, which would make him sad about missing Jango, as well as the laws of Yan.
"I'll be fine, Anakin,"
Obi-Wan promised, tugging him down to brush their foreheads together. Anakin flushed slightly and nodded, and was soon off with Ayla, heading for one of the area's older Padawans and young knights repurposed for hanging out. When they arrived, the twin knights Tipli and Tiplar were already there. While closer in age to Ayla than himself, Anakin had attended classes with them since arriving in the temple, and he was friendly with both Mikians. Anakin enjoyed his evening with Ayla, Tipli, and Tiplar, making up somewhat for the even more over-the-top than usual holodrama Ayla had chosen, imported from Ryloth, complete with overblown plot interrupted by spontaneous musical numbers. It was late when Anakin finally returned to the apartment he shared with Obi-Wan, and he wasn't overly surprised to find Quinlan passed out on the sofa in the common area. Going to the kitchenette, Anakin filled the glass of water and left it on the low table in the common room. He left another on Obi-Wan's nightstand after checking and finding his mentor passed out in his undertunics. At least he hadn't gone to bed in his full robes. Come morning, Anakin was the first one up, a rarity. He stumbled to the fresher and washed up, then dressed in what was, for him, everyday gear. Black armor-weave jumpsuit, knee-high boots with durasteel toes and fronts, and black synth leather tabards over his jumpsuit, his sole concession to Jedi garb. For missions, he had synth leather and durasteel gauntlets and greaves, too. The gauntlets were the same set that Obi-Wan had given him years before, although altered and upgraded as he grew and became more proficient in their use. Voss was still passed out on the couch when Anakin finished dressing, and so Anakin shrugged and put on the kettle. Obi-Wan stumbled out in an oversized old undertunic when Anakin began frying sausages and eggs, bleary-eyed and wild-haired. Anakin wisely held in his snort of amusement as Obi-Wan poured himself kaf and guzzled it scalding hot instead of brewing his usual shig. "Thanks for the water," Obi-Wan muttered and all but collapsed at the table, head cradled in his arms. "Remind me never to drink again." "Here," Anakin said quietly and pushed some toast at him. Obi-Wan groaned and nibbled at it slowly. Before long, Quinlan stumbled over and joined Obi-Wan, drinking his hot kaf in almost the same manner. "Fuck me," Quinlan moaned, then poured himself another mug of kaf. "Sorry, married," Obi-Wan said primly, although the joke fell a bit flat. Definitely missing Jango more than usual. Anakin owed the Mandalore a punch to the face when the Hutton finally surfaced. Obi-Wan refilled his mug, although this time he went for Shig rather than kaf. Quinlan just grumbled, leaning over to press a kiss against Obi-Wan's mussed hair. Quinlan didn't stay long, stealing a couple sausages out of the pan and then shuffling off, muttering about research. "Plans for the day?" Anakin asked when Obi-Wan had perked up a bit. "Catching up on messages," Obi-Wan said with a grimace. "Yoda said we'll probably only get a week or so of downtime, or rather data work. They want us to look at the last data burst Yan sent from Camino. We'll probably be heading there before long, to see if we can pick up what sent him to Geonosis." Anakin nodded. It seemed almost cruel, but he could sort of understand the Council's reasoning. As Jan's former Padawan, Obi-Wan was familiar with the way his old mentor thought and conducted his investigations. "I'm also going to repaint my pauldron," Obi-Wan said, tapping his right shoulder. That was the pauldron Anakin knew that boasted the sigil of the Jedi Order. Probably red, Anakin guessed, in Dooku's honor. The Mando'a used red to honor a parent, and Anakin knew Obi-Wan thought of Dooku as something like a father. He nodded. "You have plans?" Obi-Wan asked, rising and carrying his dishes into the kitchenette. "Messages, see you in temple," Anakin said with a shrug. "Probably look for some sparring partners and see what's in the hangars." "All your usual haunts, then," Obi-Wan said with a slight smile, and Anakin shrugged. Their use denying the truth. "All right, then," Obi-Wan said, and went off to start his day. When Anakin returned hours later, Obi-Wan was out. Stealing into his mentor's room, as he had so many times before, Anakin looked over Obi-Wan's beskar. The changes were easy to spot. The pauldron had been painted in deep red, and picked out on top was the Jedi Order's ancient symbol of wings and raised saber in the sandy gold shade of vengeance. It was clear Obi-Wan had done some maintenance as well, mending weak spots in the armor weave and ensuring everything was in top order. It wasn't an altogether bad idea, and Anakin knew his own kit could probably use some attention, especially if they would be sent out again soon. With a sigh, he went to gather his things. Their furlough ended up being about 2 standard weeks, although a good portion of that was spent reading and organizing the information Dooku had sent before his ship was destroyed. The information on the cloned soldiers alone was more than a little disturbing. Millions of modified humans, their genome altered to make them stronger, faster, and more loyal than their as-yet unnamed genetic source. Grown at twice the rate of an unmodified human and flash-trained in their tubes until they were big enough to walk and talk upon being decanted. It was like something out of a horror hollow. The idea of Jedi becoming generals, as Dooku had outlined in the Kaminoans' plans, sat wrong with Obi-Wan too, grating against his moral code like the edge of an ill-fitting plate of armor. The concept of Jedi generals leading an army of beings who were at best enslaved, but more likely brainwashed into some sort of cultish reverence for Jedi, was even worse. What if a Jedi general gave an inadvisable order? Would such soldiers even be able to question it? Never mind refuse. Obi-Wan knew that his service record prior to taking on Anakin as a Padawan was anomalously violent for a Jedi. His military training, such as it was mostly readings on strategy and ethics, and more missions spent fighting in guerrilla wars than he really liked to think about. His time among the Mando'a had broadened his education on the subject of war considerably, but he was well aware that he was by no means an expert. The more he had learned, the clearer that had become. And yet he was likely the closest the Order had to a military strategist, save perhaps Master Yoda and some of the other more ancient masters who had lived through more violent periods. It was daunting, and even more so when Obi-Wan considered that likely Jan had only been able to glean a partial picture of the situation before rushing off to Geonosis and his death. They would hopefully recover the rest on Kamino.